Zero RB hits in a big way in week 13. And we look ahead to the player and team developments we are expecting in the fantasy playoffs. That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas, brought to you by WinBet. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. And find all of his great work at RotoViz. And it was a fun week, Shawn. Zonovan Knight, we talked about on our Saturday show. Got ourselves pretty hyped up, kind of going through it. Decided to play him on the team, the FFPC team that we talked a little bit about last week. We got a couple messages from that, from the listeners who remembered us talking about that team and realized that it did very well. It scored 217 points. This is Jalen Hurts, A.J. Brown, Tyreek Hill, Christian McCaffrey, Zonovan Knight, Garrett Wilson team. I mean, it had a lot of fun stuff happening on that roster. But yeah, it was great to see Zonovan Knight play well, right? We saw the Mike White high value touch express, right? We saw the Jets go out and run 85 plays and throw 57 passes or whatever it was. And I think there was 11 passes to the running backs. Ty Johnson gets, 6 catches as well. Knight gets 5. But Knight plays really well. Gets stuffed at the goal line a couple of times late and could have added a touchdown on top of that. I was a little bummed. They threw the ball on both 3rd and 4th down and ended up turning it over on downs. It was arguably what cost them the game. That was kind of their last best chance. And then also
on that one too, it was a situation where sometimes when you get stopped at the 1 on back-to-back plays, the first one, a beautiful 3-yard gain to get to the 1. The next one fights through, a little bit of road furniture there. I think it depends on whether or not the running back and the blocking look good on the first 2 plays, whether or not you give it a 3rd try. And if you're flailing, losing yards, again, as a viewer, it kind of depends on what you're rooting for too, what you think the play calling should be. But that one seemed like a perfect chance to give him one more shot at it.
Yeah, that was a weird one that they went to, a fade route on the next play and ended up throwing on both 3rd and 4th. We also got Samaje Perine another start. Joe Mixon. Obviously it's never a positive for on the human element to see a guy with a concussion miss multiple games. You kind of said to me last week when we were talking that, I made a comment to you off the air. I think that, the concussions are usually 1-week absences. And you're like, yeah, they're usually 1 week or sometimes multiple weeks. And unfortunately, that is the case. Sometimes we see it's either 1 or it can be like 3 or 4 or 5. It sounds like Mixon probably will be back and just miss the 2. But anytime you see the extra week, it starts to get a little concerning that things are lingering. But him being out again did open the door for Samaje Perine, a guy that we've talked about obviously all year. 2 straight good games for him as well. The high value touches there, catches a bunch of passes, gets vultured and doesn't score as well. Chris Evans scores the late go-ahead touchdown in that game on one of his 2 routes in the game. It was so funny. Jim Nantz is calling that game and he goes, something like Chris Evans just came on. He's barely been playing and he scores the go-ahead touchdown. Just came on the field. And I'm like, Nantz gets it. Nantz had Samaje Perine in his fantasy league. But we got, Zonovan Knight and Perine both, even without the touchdowns, putting up some pretty strong scores for us this week.
We did. It was a very fun week. I did a little bit of a high-stakes diary on that team for the site last week, and then obviously a little bit of an update in the Monday article. And this, too, I think gets back to some of the core concept of it, where you want to have number one, what you want to have is health. You look at the teams that have been successful this season, and not surprisingly, they are overwhelmingly the teams that are healthy. But then the flip side of that is you do see some of these teams as we go into the fantasy playoffs now, where they have survived on their main players being healthy, but they're very, very thin. And that can work. What you're trying to do is hit on enough guys to start and play. What we're looking to do, and it doesn't always work because you can get hammered yourself on injuries to where it gets wiped out and you just don't score enough points early enough. That's one of the tricky things. If you're talking about FFPC, you're talking about a 12-week race, it all happens very, very quickly. But Ben, you and I want to build teams that have a ton of flex dynamism, but are constantly looking for ways to take that next step and upgrade. And one of the things that happened this last week that was exciting is you see the James Cook game. One of the guys that we have on the bench, he was never in the conversation to play, but now maybe not even really in the conversation for this next week too. You need to see him take on a bigger role for multiple weeks if you have other options. If you don't, then obviously you plug him in. but a possibility for the race for the $1 million if we're lucky enough to get that far. And that part is exciting, but also then on the bench, Jerry Jeudy, Drake London, Treylon Burks, Jeudy and London pretty involved. Jeudy now a possibility going forward. London, despite actually playing poorly from a reality perspective, has one of his best games of the season, a 50% target share. Blair Andrews has a cool piece up on RotoViz talking about him and Blair's one big thing of the week. And then you have the really sad situation where Treylon Burks makes one of the greatest touchdown receptions you'll ever see, because beats double coverage, makes a great play on the ball, and then holds it through a vicious, dirty hit. And then unfortunately he goes out of the game. But you want to have these options, and you also want to, if it makes sense at the time, to go ahead and plug in these running backs that you just picked up. You want to have the flexibility to do that as opposed to trying to win in just one way. I think that's one of the things that I'm excited about for this team going forward, is that we do have some options. Now, that does leave you open to a situation where you're going to have some coin flip start sit decisions with a very wide range of outcomes to where you could give up a ton of points by starting the wrong guy, and then you second guess yourself all off season. But you actually want to create those opportunities as opposed to being stuck with starting someone who simply is not good. And this season, especially with how few players have hit outside of those first two rounds, I mean, you have good teams out there that have scored a lot of points compared to other people in those leagues that, are still starting players who more or less are irrelevant or very marginal. And so you want to give yourself that opportunity. You mentioned that team. We had one of our other high stakes teams score 175 in a must-win situation. Our dynasty team clinched in the FFPC this week in terms of making the playoffs. So after a season that has featured a lot of injury to young players and has featured less than ideal pass volume to a lot of the guys that we're excited about, I think the last several weeks have illustrated that it's a short season, but it's also a season that isn't over yet. Now, the hard part is just that if you didn't make the playoffs, you can't benefit from it. It's one of the nice things where in normal leagues, you have week 13, week 14 still coming up is a chance to push through and make the playoffs. I don't think the full story of 2022 has been written yet. And it is very encouraging and exciting to see a week like this in a very important situation for fantasy managers.
Yeah, definitely the case. I mean, you say you don't think the full season has been, or story has been written yet for this season. I mean, it's super biased, but like the full story is not going to be written when the season's over either. So we're gonna have plenty to talk about this offseason about what could have or should have happened. It's been one of those years. I mean, that's just I think the fair and honest interpretation of the ways things have played out. But yeah, we have some really fun teams, some exciting teams. That team that we're talking about, one of the criticisms of Zero RB in the past, before I think it caught on a little bit more and people have understood sort of the value of it, the core tenets of why it can work and how it makes sense. But one of the criticisms was it's a strategy for large tournaments. You give up so many points early with the running backs and everything, and you're sort of just hoping that if everything comes together, you hit on those great late season running backs like Zonovan Knight or whoever, and he goes on and has this great stretch, and you have all the receivers, and you can have the superpower team, but it doesn't work as well in a 12-team league, or it's not as necessary in a 12-team league. It is the way to build the most dominant possible team, but you don't need to do it. That's sort of a silly argument, and the team we're talking about isn't even a Zero RB team. It's a Christian McCaffrey team, but this is an example of a team that is coming together like that, where we did have some bumps in the road. We barely snuck into the playoffs. So that sort of silly argument discussion is also true about this team. It feels a little like a team that is coming on. I mean, they scored 217 points this week. And I said to you, if there's one thing, like we won our matchup by 87 points. If there's one thing, like I wish they would have held on to that score for the shootout. That's, you need a couple of those types of weeks and you have a shot at the $1 million. But I mean, this is the type of team you look at and you're like, this team can score 200 points multiple weeks in a row. It's got a lot of paths. There are spots in our lineup where, I mean, we left points on the table, frankly. Did we play Treylon Burks on that team? I don't have it pulled up right now, but I thought
No,
he did.
he went to the bench
Okay.
for these 0 RB fill-in players, and it was a tough decision because he's coming on, and then the other sort of it's a subplot for us, but it's the main plot for the Tennessee Titans. You have a game here where they needed Treylon Burks to go off in order to offset this massive game that AJ Brown was having against them. You almost feel a little bit bad for the Titans GM here, where the pick that they actually got for AJ Brown was a huge mistake that has cost him his job. You do have a situation where Burks drafted in the same general range and looks like he's going to be a hit. And if he plays that whole game and balances what AJ Brown does, at least to an extent, then maybe we're having a little bit of a different conversation. But perhaps not. Obviously, ownership was not happy with the direction, whether it's making such a terrible first-round pick or the bigger picture of not building out the receiving group. Obviously, there's frustration there with the quarterback spot, even though Ryan Tannehill, when he's healthy and there are people around him, is a very solid NFL player. He's probably not a Super Bowl winner for you. And it's interesting because the Titans have been so good under Vrabel. And they seem to be one of these teams that can win in a way that a lot of the analytics will tell you is suboptimal. It's interesting, given the direction that football has gone this year, kind of moving a little bit more in that direction, that they would make the move right now. They were looking for a situation where there was an embarrassment that they could move on from a GM who, from a win-loss perspective, has been pretty successful.
Yeah, that was an interesting storyline for sure. I think we talked this offseason, how big this offseason was in terms of the turnover and the storylines. And we don't see receivers like this moved around. And one of the big bets that a lot of these teams were making was that one individual receiver doesn't have that much of an impact, that you need more depth probably to your passing game. We've seen Devonta Adams and Tyreek Hill and AJ Brown. There used to be the whole thing in fantasy where receivers changing teams have a really poor track record. And then, I've talked about this on the show before, but our buddy Rich Rebar has done a lot of great work on this and has argued typically the ones that are changing teams are guys coming off career years, that there's a reason the team is letting them walk. We have not seen guys like Devonta Adams and Tyreek Hill and AJ Brown move teams. Really, the first two were DeAndre Hopkins and Stephon Diggs a couple of years ago, right? But that's like we don't see a lot of guys in their prime like that moving teams. And those two did continue to excel on their new rosters. We've seen it with Adams, we've seen it with Hill, we've seen it with AJ Brown. You make this bet that you don't need AJ Brown's talent, and then you watch him have the impact he's had on Jalen Hurts passing on the Eagles offense, and they're 11-1. That I think is a big part of it too. Maybe they were looking for, an embarrassing moment, and they're looking for a reason to fire him, and they're looking for a way out. But I think that one bet was such a huge one that was just wrong. And I don't know that I even was confident, as much as I love AJ Brown, but that I was confident that was going to be wrong to the degree it has been, that the Chiefs were going to look wrong, frankly. I don't think they are we've talked about this a lot. The depth that they've added at the pass catching core is great, but I think the way that they moved on from Tyreek Hill and the impact Tyreek Hill's had on Miami has gone better for Miami than I anticipated it would. And same thing, I think, with the Devonta Adams impact for the Raiders, better than I anticipated it would. Worse for the Packers than I anticipated probably that it would have been, because Rodgers has been able to elevate multiple receivers throughout his career. And that's been a complete swear word show. It's just been horrible without Devonta Adams there in the wide receiver room for Green Bay. So that whole storyline, it's costing GMs their jobs now, it seems like.
And one of the issues here that I think is interesting is the way in which the timing matters, and having an interruption can be a much bigger element for a reality team than, say, if you're doing this same basic approach on your own dynasty roster, where we do talk about this idea of perpetual reloading all the time, and it can be pretty effective. Now, if you moved one of those guys in dynasty this year too, you're probably regretting that, but there are some ways that you can cover over it. most of these teams are hoping to do what the Vikings did, where you move Diggs, but then you draft Justin Jefferson. And we've had a lot of draft hits. You look at this season, and it looks like most of these guys are going to be hits. The issue, and you see this also in Green Bay, as you just mentioned, is that any little interruption there and injuries have really played a big role in terms of how some of this has been looked at. If Treylon Burks had been healthier through the offseason in the early part of the year, if he doesn't suffer the concussion here, he's had a variety of different injuries that have kept him from being able to do what they wanted. The injury to Rashad Bateman has really highlighted the Marquise Brown trade for the Ravens. The injuries to Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs, to where they haven't gotten Watson until sort of the end, and Doubs isn't there with him now, really highlights that. I mean, you can make a pretty strong argument that most of these teams who are making the moves are also going to benefit, because one of the things that you do is you get these draft picks that are extremely valuable, just extremely valuable for team building, and you get all of that money back. And they're saying, look, you can say we lost this guy, but we can redeploy that money elsewhere. The problem is simply that you've got to deploy that money, number one, and you've got to deploy it effectively, and you have to understand what the trends for the specific season are going to be. One of the things that has been very clear in 2022 is that with the evolution of defenses, almost the only wide receivers who are still winning and making passing games viable are the absolute stars. I mean, the only guys who are beating these coverages are guys like Devontae Adams and Tyreek Hill and A.J. Brown, and you just moved them, and now it is a real dagger for the team because you were not able to replace that fast enough in a high-profile enough way for it not to have been a problem.
Right. But I'm completely with you that these are, I mean, I think our default, and this is sort of, as I was saying, it's panned out better for the teams acquiring the high profile wide receivers than I expected, because what I expected was that it was going to be disastrous for some of these teams. It's going to be disastrous for the Raiders. It still is tough for the Raiders that they have this long-term high dollar contract and are not winning right now. It's obviously a different story for the Dolphins and the Eagles, who are winning right now. I mean, those are teams that are moving in the right direction and have the salary offset with the rookie quarterback contracts and all those things.
Yeah, it should be true.
Is that what we call it? Rookie quarterback contract? What do we call early? Do we call it rookie contract? I guess we do. Yeah. My brain is only half worked it. But yeah, the teams that traded away those players get both the picks and the cap. I mean, as you just laid out, they have outs, right? And I think you make a great point with the Packers. So when the Christian Watson's come on, and if Dobbs is healthy, that looks like a tandem that could be really good in the future. They might be a year away. I mean, there's all this talk Rodgers might retire. That's a team that could rebound next year if those two receivers are this impactful. As impactful as Christian Watson has looked, and Dobbs has looked like he could be, but that's a guy's been earning volume, but when he was healthy, but was not efficient on it. Had some drops issues, had some rookie mistakes, but still looks like a guy who, give him a couple of years or even one off season to develop what he had already done before he got hurt, could be
looks
good.
Like somebody who will actually get open a lot easier than Christian Watson. Watson, right. The kind of guy who will just consistently deliver big plays in an offense that's dynamic, and Jordan Love looks better. And so, I mean, the Packers now have multiple ways to play that. One of the things that you see with the Packers, and obviously I think they got lucky to an extent with Dobbs and their evaluation, but lucky / good. I mean, you've got to do some work and make some solid picks in that range. But these teams have to make multiple moves, and that probably is the area where some of the teams fell down. Where you look at the Chiefs, and they move Hill, and they took a lot of different shots at trying to fix it because they understood that there are no guarantees at the next tier down. When you're moving a Tyreek Hill, you're not going to just be able to replace that. And so they add Juju and MVS and Sky Moore, someone like a Justin Watson even trying to fill in the back, but then you take the shot on Kadarius Toney. I mean, they're still looking to try and fix all of those things, where the Titans go out and select a Robert Woods, where, I mean, I don't necessarily think that was a terrible move, and yet the fact that the Rams will prefer to have a washed-up Allen Robinson over a Robert Woods probably is a pretty big red flag. I mean, Julio Jones had been better than all of those guys. And for them to be so sure that he was the wrong play, which was also true. But you've got to fix it in multiple ways. You can't just take a rookie receiver. You can't just rely on a Rashad Bateman, because then you get so thin. I don't think that the actual overall plan executed by the Titans and the Ravens really will work, because you just need more receiving firepower than that.
Yeah,
And the flip side of it is that the whole point of some of these other teams is that they already actually had someone who was good. I mean, you've got a Jalen Waddle, you've got a Devontae Smith, and you want to put together an offense that has so much flexibility. You've got to be on that side of it in the modern NFL, not on this side where we're going to take a shot to have like one contingency-based type of play fill it, because you can very easily then have zero.
That's really interesting, the Waddle and Smith point, because I just talked about the rookie QB contracts. You also have a receiver on a rookie contract that is hit already. And so you have good offensive pieces in place at both quarterback and receiver that are not costing you a ton, and the ability to now add a high-profile receiver at a high cap hit and not really be allocating too much overall cap to your passing game. Still have some flexibility. It's really kind of a unique situation with both the Eagles and Dolphins, but they've executed it very well. The flip side of that, making a big trade like this, when it goes bad, it can go really bad. And I'm going to make this our win bet segment of the week. Sign up today to receive a special sports offer. Bet $100, win $100. Download the WinBet app now, or visit wynnbet.com to start winning. Shawn, while we're talking about these long-term things today, I haven't let you have a proper victory lap around the Russell Wilson trade, because we had a lot of conversations about that. I was not particularly optimistic. And then even in the early parts of this year when we're talking about it, I mean, I think we all sort of just expected that Russell Wilson was going to play somewhat better at some point, that Geno Smith wasn't going to actually look like the better long-term quarterback by the end of the season. I think that's very likely to now be the case at the end of this season. I mean, Russell Wilson has shown no signs of improvement. If anything, it is getting worse. There's some potential for him to rebound, but the Broncos gave up tons of assets, a monster contract, and missed on the player they acquired. And this is what can happen now. The Seahawks are now set up in a situation where there's other layers to this. The fact that they had Geno Smith and he has hit to the degree he has, which is another thing that you were on since like February, frankly, as we talked about this. I mean, what are your long-term thoughts on the Seahawks now? Update for people who have been listening since the Russell Wilson trade and heard us all talk about it. I want to hear what you see in the future for the Seahawks and for the Broncos.
This has been absolutely bizarre, right? Because as you mentioned, you have that first month that is more or less devastating for the Broncos. You have this first month for Geno Smith where he looks like he can actually play. And you're still expecting him to turn into a pumpkin and Russell Wilson to your expectations totally shift for Wilson. Going from him being a potential Pro Bowl player and taking the Broncos into this battle with the Chiefs and the Chargers for AFC West supremacy and potentially even to the Super Bowl, to now you're thinking, okay, he's going to bounce back and he's going to be more of, in that Ryan Tannehill type of range, perhaps. But he's going to be a solid quarterback. I mean, even someone like a Dak Prescott has had a couple of bumps, and then once he gets healthier, once he gets back into the rhythm of what they're doing, you see these blow up games again, and you're expecting it to, now that you've got new expectations, for him to sort of hit those, and for this kind of regression concept that people obviously talk about for very good reason all the time, that these guys are going to get closer together. And instead, what has happened is that if anything, Wilson has continued to slide and decline and look totally helpless to elevate his team in any way. And Geno has looked like a guy who is gaining confidence and has the weapons, which not that we thought it was completely Wilson or completely Lockett Metcalf. You're always looking at that as a balance of the two. But I think it would be completely revisionist to say that we didn't think that Russell Wilson was a big part of why a guy like Tyler Lockett has been such a good vertical receiver, why a big body touchdown threat like DK Metcalf is such a weapon. Geno Smith is demonstrating with his passing acumen that, yeah, I mean, those guys are really good players, and that helps you if you are a solid quarterback like he is. His numbers in the accuracy department, this was a weird game for the Seahawks this last week, right? Where the Rams somehow get 171 rushing yards, even though no one individually succeeds. The quarterback play, again, poor. They have no receivers at this point. Geno has a pretty good game, and yet they need every single one of his plays and yards, including that final touchdown, to come from behind and win. I think in these situations, you're expecting a guy who is a backup quarterback through his career, who originally busts out when he's a young player, to get into kind of some of these situations and not be able to get the job done. And then the Seahawks are going to fade because the Seahawks still don't have an overall roster that's that talented. And yet he makes those plays, and the quality of his individual throws is stunning. And so then it kind of goes back to this question of decision making, because we know that the throw caliber is important, and yet there are lots of guys who have big, accurate arms. You have to be able to process information quickly and pull the trigger, and that's been the thing that has elevated Tua, especially within the context of this scheme that Mike McDaniel is running. You have the decision making, the information processing, and then the accuracy on that. But Geno is doing so many of those things as well, is making the right read and the big throw in the big moment. It's been a lot of fun. I still think that there are going to be some hurdles, some obstacles, some games where you don't pull out the win at the end. Anybody who kind of gets to where he is in his career is going to always have to now prove that he can do it, as opposed to getting a lot of chances like the younger quarterbacks who were drafted early get for that stretch. But I'm pretty enthusiastic. And so I like the way that one is going. The situation with the Broncos is stunning, and it's one where it does give you a sense. I mean, there are some parallels to big, massive blockbuster, dynasty trades where someone goes all in on an older player and that guy declines or gets hurt, and then you're just done for good. It's not just that he's bad, but they're locked into this massive contract that is completely and totally debilitating. They're going to obviously have everybody fired in the offseason. You're going to get a new scheme. You're going to get better offensive coaching. You're going to bring somebody in who can take advantage of the more limited things that he still does well or can do a little bit. And so I think that he's going to play better, especially because you still have some decent weapons around him. And having Javonte Williams back at the point that he does come back healthy, obviously there are concerns with how quickly he'll be able to recover from that pretty serious injury. But you have guys like Courtland Sutton. One of the things, too, is I think that it's unfortunate for him that they probably don't have the playmakers that Seattle has. Courtland Sutton, one of these guys who has been solid in the NFL, has had some serious injuries, does have the big body that we like. He's got the vertical ability that we like. But one of the reasons why in most of our drafts we defaulted to Jeudy was that Judy's a little bit less expensive. He's younger. He comes from this group of Alabama wide receivers that has generally been good. And Jeudy, at many points when those 3-4 guys were together, was the best of them or the second best of them. And yet, I mean, he can't stay healthy. And so Wilson has not been able to get out there and play with this juggernaut that is Sutton, Jeudy, KJ Hamler with the vertical ability, Dulcich healthy from the start. I mean, it helps that Dulcich is available and playing well now. So this is going to get better, but I mean, you're going to have to find a rising star coach who is willing to hitch his early career legacy to this QB situation and this contract situation that is absolutely devastating. What's your thoughts on the Broncos and if they can find this, and if they do find that, if they find their own Mike McDaniel, is that enough to turn this around?
Well, and not only hitch it to this situation, but there's so much additional context with Russell Wilson being a guy who, from a personality perspective, seems to be someone that rubs everyone sort of the wrong way because he's kind of whatever he is. Like Russell Wilson, I think anyone listening understands what I'm getting at. I don't even know how I would describe it, but it is like, if you're a young quarterback, is that the guy you want to go work with? Somebody that might be difficult to communicate with or find the right common ground with? I mean, some of the stuff we've seen on the sidelines and, mean, he got chewed out by one of his defensive players just a couple of weeks ago. Earlier in the season, we saw him walking around. We were joking, rah-rah, and, doing junior varsity stuff, telling his team to yell out pass or run on the sideline for his defense. And I don't know that that's the coaching opportunity I'd want to take if I was some young up-and-coming head coach, where everything revolves around getting that guy to be successful. From a personality standpoint, it does seem tough. And it seems when you hear from his ex-teammates and, because there's been some Richard Sherman podcasts and Marshawn Lynch podcasts. And, there was a storyline at one point. Lynch tried to reach out to him and couldn't get a hold of him, had to go through a former Super Bowl winning teammate had to go through his, manager or whatever. And Lynch's comment was like, if I have to do that, I'm not going to call you. I was just trying to reach out and give you some positive, reinforcement. But that sucks. The Broncos,
well, it's not great for those guys that they're saying those things publicly. I don't think that reflects well on them. Yet at the same time, these are guys you won Super Bowls with who maybe don't care for you. Imagine what it's like in a losing culture.
Right. In the locker room. That's the exact point I'm trying to make. Broncos have scored the fewest points in the NFL by a lot, 166 points. The Texans are at 188. The next closest team, 22 points higher.
How are you trailing the Texans?
There's no other team with fewer than 200. You're trailing the Texans by a good margin. You're trailing everyone else. The Rams are next at 201. Trailing everyone else by like 35 points, and you score about, 15 points a game. You're going to need a couple extra games to even make up for that. It's brutal. And then you go look at the Seahawks side of it. And Sean, you were right. This all sets up very nicely. I thought this was going to be a late pick for them that they got in this trade. It's now currently the third overall pick that Seattle's going to get out of the Russell Wilson trade. That's insane. One of the really interesting things about where they go is what do they do with Geno Smith, who's going to be a free agent after this year. We talked a little bit in the offseason when the Falcons signed Marcus Mariota. I was arguing they should do like a 4-year lower dollar deal, extend him and lock him into like a backup level salary. Yes, obviously, if he plays to a certain level, he's going to want more money, but it's kind of the same deal here in Seattle. And this is the point I was trying to make. Where like, if they were going to go with Geno Smith, they almost should have offered him multiple years and more guaranteed money before he played, frankly, right? When from an organizational standpoint, because what I saw from a Seattle beat writer the other day was pitching 3 years and $100 million for him as the contract this offseason, which is like a Kirk Cousins contract, $30+ million a year, short-term deal. And he's kind of like, who says no? Well, if you're Seattle, that's a lot. That now you're going into the team building situation where when you have a quarterback contract that's a $30 million contract, no matter who it is, that makes things tighter. They have to play to a certain level. Geno has played to that level, but he has to continue to play to that level for 3 years. That's a challenge, right? If they go to that direction, if they had him locked up for a couple of years at a more reasonable salary because they had the foresight to extend him before they made him the starter, basically. Obviously they'd be in a much better position. And even if they had to give him a raise, they wouldn't have to give him $30 million, right?
And the aging element does also matter here in the way that you look at superstars versus simply good players. And you're witnessing that some with Russell Wilson, where he was a superstar, but the parts that you actually can take with you into your mid-30s are maybe different. And so he's not a superstar there. Back 5, 6, 7 years ago, RotoDoc did some really great machine learning research on aging curves and a little more sophisticated than some of the stuff you see out there. And his takeaway, which is very intuitive, but it is something that it's worthwhile to know, is that there are different aging paths for different level of player. And so, I always kind of think about just how extraordinary it is right now that you have these 3 superstar men's tennis players who are dominating in their mid to late 30s. Obviously, you have on the women's side, you had Serena dominating very, very late. You think about Tom Brady and still playing. You look at Aaron Rodgers and still playing.
Travis Kelce,
a huge example. You look at the wide receivers who are blowing up right now, who are not young guys. And one of the things I kind of like about this season is that I do think it's going to convince a lot of fantasy managers to play incorrectly for a long time. There are a lot of layers to that, and we'll get into that through the offseason. But one of the things that I definitely mentioned several times on the site, I think that you and I talked probably a little bit on the show, is that I didn't necessarily think it was the most likely result but there was a possibility for the 2022 season to be very much like 2016. And as a result of that, everyone then go back to playing fantasy football wrong for 3, 4, 5, 6 years, what have you. It wasn't most likely, and it's not an identical one-to-one kind of situation, but there are a ton of similarities between what happened in 2016 and what's happened this year in 2020 from a fantasy perspective. And you can look at these things on the reality side as well, and how obviously those things are all going to then filter down into fantasy. But one of the issues here is that players the level of Adams and Hill and Diggs are going to be able to do some things if they don't get hurt. DeAndre Hopkins, these guys are going to be able to do some things. And Hopkins has both the injuries and this, kind of sketchy suspension where there are a lot of questions there. It looks like he's come out of that in a very positive situation. They're going to be able to do some things 28, 29, 30, and then maybe, going to 35, that type of area where, they're very, very good.
Yeah.
There's going to be the temptation to then apply that to players who are just barely the next level down, and it does not apply.
Right.
It's also true at the quarterback. And so when you're talking about a guy now who has gotten his second win, or really his first win, but is now doing it in such a huge way, I don't think that reality teams really want to be tethered to those guys. And it is important. And your suggestion was absolutely right with Mariota, with the situation with Geno. And this is something that is kind of unfair to the player. It gives the team a lot of leverage. But the business side of it isn't necessarily about fairness. One of the things that's kind of back in the news is that there's this debate between guaranteed contracts and non-guaranteed contracts. The players obviously would like everything to be structured so it has to be guaranteed, which would really help them in negotiating. One of the things that always strikes me as a little bit weird about that, and maybe there's an element that I am still not completely understanding, but you can negotiate for a fully guaranteed contract. You just have to have the other side of that negotiation be willing to pay it. One of the things that we're here, and we're just 1 week in, and I don't think you can really tell anything from the first week, even though if you are frustrated that Deshaun Watson has been able to get back out there and play after
20 plus credible accusations, reportedly 50 or more that were out there from the New York Times report that came out, a little bit later in the summer.
So almost certainly a sexual predator.
Yeah.
Still, there are two sides to the stories. Watson's side seems to simply be that he doesn't take it that seriously, and neither should you. But one game in, not great there. That could change. That could turn around. And you would expect that it will turn around over time. But the Browns have also made this massive, massive bet on someone who has some really big red flags in terms of whether he'll even be able to play in the future. And then you've missed so much time. And you have gotten older, even though you're still young. Do you bring, what are the comparisons there to Russell Wilson in terms of what he brings? Now, again, I think that Deshaun Watson was a better player than Russell Wilson. And so from that perspective, I would still expect him to eventually succeed. But you've got some of these massive, more or less guaranteed contracts for the quarterbacks that now make it, almost like these 2-point conversions, where one of the things people hate to do, even if it's the percentage play, is to put everything, all your chips down on one instance. The teams have kind of built that in for themselves now. But what you could have done back at the beginning, in all likelihood, is not only have a multi-year contract in place for some of these guys, but to structure it so if they don't actually come through, because that was not the expectation. The Seahawks are spinning this the whole time where he's having to compete with Drew Lock. Now, one of the reasons that we were on him is that, number one, Drew Lock is terrible and has demonstrated that consistently and recently, whereas Geno Smith played pretty well last year and is probably just a bigger talent. He's somebody that I like coming out of college, and so that always kind of sticks with you a little bit. But when they're spinning it like that, they're creating even more leverage to do one of these contracts. He was not guaranteed to even win the starting job. It's definitely looked at as a bridge situation. If you're approached with a non-guaranteed multi-year contract, and it's even part of, more or less the deal in terms of getting your shot at it. Again, I don't think that's necessarily the fair way to do it, but there were a lot of things that some of these teams could have done.
And that's why I was saying, probably at a certain point they can hold out and you might have to extend them, but then you're in a position of power where you have, again, it's the business side of it. It's a little gross, but like from a team perspective, you do have him under contract, and you're in a situation where you can dictate how much of a raise basically that you're willing to accept. Similar to the Mariota point, I mean, my argument with Mariota was you're probably going to have a rookie come in at some point. And so if you sign him for multiple years, you're also going to have a rookie QB contract to pair with that probably. And then your whole quarterback room still not that expensive. And Mariota's your like a slightly overpaid backup for a couple of years. And we had a good idea he was at that level. If you feel Geno's good enough to start this year and you feel he's going to be good enough to at least be a backup, and that's one of the big questions now for Seattle is they could let him walk in with that third overall pick if they do end up there. Take one of these great quarterbacks, right? I mean, you would like to have Geno, even if it was just 2 more seasons at a reasonable, slightly overpaid backup type rate and a rookie together. Now your quarterback room is, in terms of, the business side of football and being on the GM's perspective, obviously not as fun for the players, right? But that would have been, I think, a really nice position to be in where you could draft a rookie, have multiple options, and have it at a combined salary that is very manageable relative to the league-wide quarterback salaries.
And if you are in a situation then where you're able to get someone else who has an even higher ceiling and you go that direction, you can move these guys. I mean, teams were able to move Carson Wentz and Baker Mayfield, right? You can move players. You can get potentially something back if the guy is good and is on a reasonable contract. I mean, one of the things that you already are kind of expecting with the Patriots is that they'll be able to move Bailey Zappi, even though, I mean, all he really has done is play solidly for a couple of games. But the market and the demand for quarterbacks who can start successfully is immense.
It's crazy high, yeah. If you hit on that rookie in your Seattle, and then you also have Geno in for a couple more years at a reasonable salary, I mean, you could trade him for a lot, probably a second-round pick or more. I mean, who knows? But yeah, that's all very interesting to see where that goes. We were talking about Denver for a moment, and one of the other parts of that, and you mentioned with our team, I want to circle all the way back to, is the receivers. And you talked about, very briefly that maybe the Seattle receivers are even better. Probably at this point, we can say that. DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, 2 really good players. Sutton and Judy are guys that, as a fantasy industry, we thought would be elevated by Russell Wilson's ability to elevate the efficiency of his pass catcher. Some of that's because he takes sacks at a high rate and all of that. When he does let go of the ball, traditionally, back in the Seattle days, lower pass rate. Part of the reason his pass attempts were never through the roof was he did take a lot of sacks, and he's a little bit of a scrambler when he's younger. And so you have a lot of dropbacks. There's basically 3 outcomes on a dropback, either a sack, a scramble, or a pass attempt. He's a guy who the percentage of dropbacks that turned into pass attempts was reasonably low. And yet it meant that they were higher percentage passes when he did let him go. He was, extending the play in the backfield and not getting sacked and then throwing and hitting these big plays. And so you had this elevation of efficiency for his receivers, not just Lockett and Metcalf, but guys before that. I mean, made Jermaine Kearse look really good. Doug Baldwin, has a great career with him. A lot of other guys, his tight ends have always had pretty strong efficiency. You go over to Denver, not only is he not elevating their efficiency, he's been poor for their efficiency. You and I had a lot of discussions about Sutton and Judy. We have Judy on this roster that we really like. You mentioned to me that it might be time to think about putting Judy back in the lineup. And I told you before the show, I had kind of a visceral reaction to that because it is one where that's one of the few guys that we've kind of over the last couple of years disagreed on a little. I was higher on Sutton this year. I think Sutton's been an even bigger disappointment. If anything, I think you've won that discussion. And yet I don't really fully buy into Judy as a player. And then you talk about the situation. It's a real challenge. So you also mentioned, can we trust him to just stay healthy for a game? Because we've had multiple games now where he's left early, injured in our lineup. Sell me on Jerry on potentially playing Jerry Judy going forward. Because as soon as you mentioned that, I was like, I can't. It feels so hard to put him into a lineup right now. And I'm sure some of the listeners are having the same sort of internal discussion with themselves if they have Judy on their roster.
But if you want me to make an argument for Jerry Judy, I will. It is one of those tricky ones where you have to do it very uncomfortably, right? The argument for Judy is that within the context of this excruciatingly bad passing attack, he's done some vaguely interesting things in that his yards per reception well above that of Cortland Sutton. The yards per target, well above. He has more than double the yards after catch per game, and that obviously includes multiple games where he's going out more or less right away. Then you look back to the stretch before the previous injury where he appeared to be coming on as the key weapon in the attack. The first month, a little bit slow, weeks 5 through 8, 25% target share. He has weeks 7 and 8 where he scores nicely. Then, unfortunately, you get the second time where he has one of the big injuries. He misses a big chunk. He comes back in this game last week where I really didn't expect him to play again last week. It seemed like he was one more week away. They do play him. He is, again, the guy with Dulcich who sort of leads the way at receiver. And then you have the Sutton injury. So then your question is always, I mean, this passing attack is so bad. Do you probably not actually need Sutton out there to pull a little bit of the defensive attention? Do you really want Jeudy to be out there on his own if that turns out to be the case this week? I think if you're looking at Jeudy, though, you're looking at a guy who has managed a mildly positive season in a brutal environment and now could be someone who has 35, 40%, 45% target share, at least for a week. It's a little bit like the play last week with Drake London, where even though, again, the Falcons don't pass the ball hardly at all and don't pass the ball very effectively because he has the 50% share, you're into that environment where he can score. If you have some better options, you still want to go that route. But again, this season where it's so difficult to find solid wide receiver plays, even for playoff teams, if you have Jeudy, then I think you have to at least consider him.
So, Sean, maybe we'll close today with a few running back discussions. We talked a little bit about the Niners last Saturday, and we did see Christian McCaffrey play over 80% snaps, which was even kind of on the high end of what we were talking about. But we had talked on the show, he hadn't hit 70% snaps in multiple weeks, and we were kind of expecting that would bump up, and it did. Jordan Mason had the 8 carries, but didn't play nearly as much as Elijah Mitchell has been. They were all low-value touches. McCaffrey had all of the touches in the green zone and ran a ton of routes, 10 high-value touches. Very exciting day for him. Be interesting to see how things go forward with the quarterback position, but I was pretty optimistic about Brock Purdy just being able to facilitate. You don't obviously expect a ton, but so much skill position talent there, good offensive design. He had a really low ADOT, but again, that favors McCaffrey. And I think it fits, what they might want to be able to do. And so, yeah, I think you have to be really excited about McCaffrey going forward. Another note I had in Stealing Signals this week was on Joshua Kelly. He played 43% of the snaps. That was the most of any Chargers backup all season. We were getting a little bit excited about Isaiah Spiller. A couple weeks ago, the highest he hit was 25% of the snaps. There was a point where Sony Michel hit as high of a rate as 32% of the snaps, but that was the game back in week 6 when Kelly got hurt. Prior to Kelly going down, he had also gotten up to a 38% snap share in the game week 5, right before he got hurt in week 6. He came back in week 12, played 21%, now up to 43% in week 13. I think we've gotten enough of an indication. This is one I've been tracking in Stealing Signals all year because from a high-value touch perspective, the Chargers as a team, way above everyone else. So we talked about how their offense is pretty pass-heavy, but using that short passing game as an extension of the run, sort of the Drew Brees methodology in New Orleans for a lot of years. We don't see a lot of offenses doing that right now. The Chargers are one where figuring out that number 2 spot felt pretty important to me. Kelly also ran routes on 30% of dropbacks or 31%. I don't have that number right in front of me, but a good chunk. Looks like he's probably the guy to have rostered. And I think he should be rostered everywhere because if something were to happen to Austin Eckler, I'd still think pretty strongly somebody in this backfield is going to be very playable in PPR.
And this is sort of the poor man's version of the P. Ryan play. I don't think either of us like Kelly need to the extent or nearly to the extent that we like P. Ryan as a talent. It is interesting that, he's carried 32 times, so it's more or less fluky and random what you're looking at in terms of his advanced numbers, but he does have a 25% evasion rate on the season. He does have more than 3 yards after contact per attempt as his average. The yards before contact are bad. This offense hasn't been great for blocking. We know that some of the specific plays he's been asked to run are probably not going to be conducive for that. I also just don't think he's that good yet, even though this is a tiny little breakout season for him, and he's at least been impressive compared to Isaiah Spiller, who really looks like the other guy who might also fill that role. And like you mentioned, those high value touches are huge. And the offense would change and become even more pass centric than it is if they somehow lost Austin Eckler. But Justin Herbert's going to be able to move the ball. He's going to create some good situations for you. When you're talking about stashes, he's someone to have there.
Right. You're looking for the guy who might actually run routes. And I think that's the key point. I completely agree with everything you said about Kelly's skill and everything else. But Eckler down to 60% snaps this week, which was kind of bizarre to see, but that was the lowest he's played since Kelly's last really like full game in week 5. And for a little stretch, he was at like 56, 59% snaps. Eckler's been playing significantly more, up around 70 or higher percent of the snaps until now Kelly's back. And so I think, if you are trying to dig into those, little shifts in the usage, like none of this is certain, but I think the Chargers are telling us at least that they prefer Kelly right now. I mean, obviously Isaiah Spiller, I agree with you, is another guy that's in the mix. But if Eckler were to miss time, I would be comfortable based on what we've seen. Say Eckler gets hurt this next week, I would be pretty comfortable playing Kelly the next week if I needed a running back start, obviously.
And that might be, at least we think it is, less a case where if the starter got hurt, then everything might change. One of the things about the 49ers backfield is that there's probably a big difference between the offense if it's McCaffrey and then a complementary piece versus if it's a committee with him gone. You and I did, make some predictions last week on the backups. Those seem to have been more or less accurate for the first week. For our own team, we lost Elijah Mitchell. We went ahead and added both Mason and Davis Price. More or less, if McCaffrey goes out, we're just going to be lamenting the way that things go. But those were kind of the moves we made for ourselves. Sometimes that can be helpful for other people trying to make similar moves. You mentioned the low ADOT. One of the things that's been a theme on the show for us is that the 49ers target depths had really cratered for all of those guys even before that. So you expect them to be even more conservative now that they've lost Garoppolo, but partly Purdy's being thrown into an offense where guys like Debo and Ayuk and Kittle are being used underneath just to start with. The coolest little segment in this game was a 2-play sequence where McCaffrey runs a great route down there, inside the 5, where you're looking for him to be the guy. And unlike the previous week, Purdy sees him and throws a dart. And I think everyone was stunned, including McCaffrey himself, when he dropped it.
Yeah.
Because,
a little bit behind him, but he pumps slams his fist into the ground. Definitely felt like he should have caught it.
He's so reliable there. The very next play, he comes out, slightly different route, but again, McCaffrey creating that instant separation. He's open. A second consecutive dart. He catches it, touchdown. That's encouraging for Purdy. It's encouraging for McCaffrey. It's encouraging from a play calling perspective. I mean, with Mr. Irrelevant, you're not necessarily looking at this and saying McCaffrey's going to have multiple 35-point games down the stretch. But even though it's mildly disappointing, it might even increase his floor if he can stay healthy, because they have to rely on him more now, and they're still relying on him successfully as a receiver.
I think they have to rely on him to get the most out of Purdy. I mean, what better for what Brock Purdy showed us? I don't know a lot about him, didn't know a lot about him, but he looked like a guy who didn't really feel comfortable pushing it downfield, wanted to be able to just facilitate underneath, which I think is a good trait in a backup quarterback. I mean, that can get you a 10-year career if you're able to just come in and not crater the offense, get the ball out on time underneath and complete passes. It's the Mike White equation, more or less. And we are thrilled with what Mike White's been able to do with the Jets offense. Purdy looked like he was capable of doing that, right? It's not going to elevate the offense, but there's enough skill talent there and a good enough defense that if it doesn't crater the offense, that's great. What better for that type of a quarterback to have including Deebo Samuel and George Kittle and everything. But then Christian McCaffrey, a running back who, despite being a running back and being so close to the line of scrimmage where there's so many defenders, still somehow is always 3 yards open in easy manageable throws, checkdowns. Purdy can read out the downfield element if he ever wants to take some of those downfield throws and feel very confident that he can come back down underneath the McCaffrey, which, as you mentioned, I mean, even in the red zone where it gets a lot more shrunk, he's able to find and pick out McCaffrey 2 plays in a row. I was really encouraged by that sequence as well. That was exciting to see. And I mean, it could just continue. The thing that we've talked about with McCaffrey is even when Mitchell was playing, he was getting the routes, he's getting the high value touches. I think as long as he's healthy, he's going to catch so many balls that his floor, as you said, in PPR is going to be very strong the rest of the way.
It is a couple other running back notes. We had DeAndre Swift, even though some of it came during the portion where they're really hammering the Jaguars. He jumps by Jamal Williams in some key categories, outscores him. The Lions now, and you had made this point, we did a little bit of a segment talking about how it could be similar to their old school run and shoot team. And if they are able to somehow come out with that game against the Bills, they would be just such an interesting team here. There are only a handful of teams in the NFL right now outscoring the Lions. That part is almost impossible to believe. Because Jamal Williams is so entrenched as the short yardage back, and because they definitely don't want to get Swift injured as they run out the string here, it's still going to be Williams, and then Swift is going to have to make some of these other plays, but the dynamism on his runs is coming back. The explosiveness, him as an elite receiver, and even something as small as Jameson Williams, you mentioned to me, only running the 2 routes. I think that helps him from the perspective of, as this Amon-Ra St. Brown juggernaut continues to put up big points, they need Swift as that complementary piece. So if you've been holding him through the year, that part is exciting.
But and you said Williams is entrenched as a goal line back. He very much is, especially the short yardage rushes. But I will note Swift has been getting green zone usage as well, and more on some passes and things. But multiple green zone touches in 4 straight games, 3 in each of the last 2. The Lions have had like an unsustainable number of green zone plays down inside the 10. You don't typically see teams have 5+ of those types of snaps every single game like they have for 4 straight games. But Williams has been getting 2+ every game, but Swift has as well. In this past week, Swift had 3 touches down there. Williams only had the 2. He's going to get the short yardage rushing easy TDs, but Swift still has some tight touchdown potential, basically.
I mean, we're in week 14. Is it possible that the Lions have only scored fewer touchdowns than the Philadelphia Eagles and the Kansas City Chiefs? I mean, that seems utterly bizarre. They're 5-7 with 1-score losses to the Eagles, Vikings, Seahawks, Dolphins, and Bills.
Yeah. I mean, they're good. And they're 2 games behind the Seahawks, 2.5 behind the Giants. They got a soft schedule upcoming. I'm like, they got the Vikings at home this week. This is a huge, huge game. I mean, to be able to steal a win there. But then they go at the Jets. Obviously, the Jets are playing better. At the Panthers, Bears at home. Bears are playing better as well. At the Packers. That's their close. I mean, they could lose a lot of those games, frankly. But I wouldn't be that surprised if they went 4-1 in that stretch, right? And then they would wind up 9-8 in a weak NFC. This is a team that started 1-6. We always see those types of stats of all the teams that started 1-6, only 1 out of 572 actually made the playoffs. I mean, I made that up, but we always
because most of those teams are terrible.
Yeah, most of those teams are terrible. This is a team that got to 1-6 despite close losses to some playoff teams. It would be super, super fun to see these guys make a push. And in a weak NFC, I think there's a chance.
Yeah, that would be really cool. It's possible at the end of the season there that Jordan Love could be out there for the Packers. And then just to kind of bring us to the finish line, I did want to mention, you talked about P. Ryan early in the show. It's just crazy what he's doing, right? He has 100 yards and 6 receptions in this game. Those types of games are unusual just for everybody, right? Joe Mixon only has 2 career games with 100 yards or 5 or more catches. P. Ryan this season, a 22% evasion rate, Mixon a 7% evasion rate. Talked about Mixon struggling in some of the efficiency elements, not being able to punch those touchdowns in for that stretch. Then he has the 5 touchdown game. Kind of purely beyond any self-interest that we have. And obviously we like P. Ryan and we have him on some teams. Given how well P. Ryan is playing, the Bengals should just hold Mixon out and let his brain completely recover. There's such a huge difference between completely recovered and coming back even a little bit early. It should be good for the team. It should be good for him for the long term.
And I mean, we talked about this, I think, a little bit before the show, but they like Mixon more than we do. But they're also on their way to the playoffs. And if there is concern about this lingering, the way that P. Ryan has played, I mean, you're saying what they should do, and I agree with you, but what they might actually do, we talked a little bit before, is like a 60-40 split. Why would they go back to Mixon playing a ton right now when P. Ryan's hot, playing effectively, had a really key role in a win over Kansas City last week, and Mixon is, slowly recovering from a concussion? They have said that they held him out last week for precautionary reasons. You made a great point to me that he didn't actually clear. They're saying they hope that he clears the concussion protocol early this week. There's a difference between him clearing and them holding him out for precautionary reasons and him not clearing until the following week. And so anyway, as we think about the rest of the fantasy season, 4 more weeks here, I wouldn't expect Mixon to come back to an 80% snap share or anything this week. And I don't know if in weeks 15, 16, and 17, we might see a little bit of a split. And then if they do want to turn Mixon loose, they still really like him. They might be planning for, hey, we'll save that for the postseason run. So
you told me you thought this could be a Tony Pollard, Ezekiel Elliott thing. That would be great. And this offense is both potent enough and creates enough high value touches that they would be interesting as both plays in a Pollard Elliott situation. I guess my thought is that this strikes me now as a backfield that could be like very early days, Pollard and Elliott, where it was clear. And again, some of this is revisionist, or at least in hindsight, because Pollard has continued to be so awesome. But the fantasy community wanted to see more from Pollard a long, long time ago. And he had to go out game after game after game after game and be the better player to get to where we were last week.
Yeah. And last week was exciting for Pollard. Started even with Zeke back, and snaps were all the way down to 41%, but got a goal line carry, scored, was a bigger part of the game plan than before Zeke's injury. So that was, I call this 41% snap share noise. I think, that looks bad on its face, disappointing to see, but the fact that he was the starter, the fact that he got some of, the goal line work and some of these other elements, I think very encouraging that his role has improved. But yeah, we'll see how it goes with P. Ryan and Mixon. But I'm right there with you. The team, Mixon, last healthy game, 5 touchdowns. Kind of hard to be like, we're going to take that guy off the field. At the same time, Samaje Perine, very next game, when Mixon goes out, has 3 touchdowns and then has scored again since. He's had 4 TDs since Mixon's injury. So if you're, just focusing on the touchdowns, you can't exactly fault Perine. Obviously, we in the fantasy community think that the touchdowns are somewhat fluky to a degree, but at least what Perine has done argues that, it's probably more the offense that has generated some of this, some of this upside, some of the Mixon 5 touchdown game upside. It'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see how it goes.
And so much of the argument for drafting running backs, and especially from those fantasy managers who are very adamant that you have to have the running backs, is this potential to be in an offense that would deliver the opportunity for 2, 3, 4, probably not too many 5, but 2, 3, 4 touchdown games in the fantasy playoffs and maybe back-to-back weeks. If you can get that from a non-first, second, third round draft pick, then you really hit the fantasy jackpot at that point. Ben, that'll do it for today's Stealing Bananas. I guess the last little note would be that my Chiefs did blow a game to the Bengals for the 3rd straight time. The Bengals did seem like one of the first teams that thought it was imperative to stop Travis Kelce if they wanted to win a game against the Chiefs. we'll see if that carries
His
forward a little
fumble
bit.
was the turning point. The Chiefs had the lead in the ball in the fourth quarter. Kelsey unfortunately fumbles. Bengals go down and score. Kansas City has to settle for a long field goal, misses. Bengals don't turn the ball back over. I mean, it was the second to last possession for the Chiefs. Kelsey lost the ball there with the lead. It was early in the fourth, but there was only a couple possessions after that point is the point I'm making. That was a big turning point.
Is it a sign that your fantasy football team is front and center in your mind when one of the things that you're thinking about that game is that, man, if Bucker doesn't miss that kick, we score 222? I had some family members who were very upset about Kelsey being held up and then the ball stripped. This was another week for me where the officiating is frustrating. Everything about that is called perfectly correctly. I would love to see a situation in the offseason where we don't have these scrums and the whistle blown. I would love to see in the grass brought back for the quarterbacks. I would love to see a perfect play like the Chiefs lineman made, sacking or hitting Burrow late in that game, not called pass interference because he hits him directly in the chest, which is the one spot that you're supposed to be able to hit him. When the fact that your body weight is hitting the quarterback, it's like asking players to make physically, like the physics of it, impossible types of plays. And then for defensive players to be out for as long as the person they've concussed on a penalty play to also have to miss. You can only play again once that player clears the concussion protocol. The incentives and the disincentives have to actually stop the injuries. The defensive linemen rushing the QB have no choice but to try and make some kind of contact with the quarterback and get him down. You can't fix those problems by having arbitrary penalties. When the penalties become so arbitrary that the defenders don't know what to do, you're not actually creating a disincentive. It actually makes some of the dangerous hits more likely because the players don't know what to do correctly. The flip side of that is that currently
or they just don't care because they're like, this is stupid.
Right, exactly. And then you have incentives from the defensive backs where it still makes sense for them to try and create a concussion. If Burks drops that ball, the penalty that's going to be assessed still works out in favor of the Titans. That can't be the case. You have to fix some of those issues.
You said in favor of the Titans. You meant in favor of
the Eagles, right?
In favor of the Eagles, right? Yeah, and that's silly. I mean, I completely agree. When you get those huge hits, it happened to Jacoby Myers as well this week, where he took a huge shot in the end zone last Thursday night. I don't think it would have helped the Patriots come back in that game against the Bills, but he had very similar play in the middle of the field, get hit, and he dropped it, and that's a net benefit for the Bills that they just took the 15-yard penalty as opposed to letting him complete the catch for the touchdown. Yeah, that's silly.
The NFL working on some of those things. We still want the players to be healthier. I mean, it makes for a better product, but again, the brain health of these guys is important. And even if you somehow don't care about that, I mean, the NFL is going to have some really serious problems down the line if they don't start to address some of these things. So hopefully they will. Obviously, Travis Kelce can't fumble, but it doesn't seem to me like that's even his fault necessarily. That's going to happen. Ben, we did say that the passing matchup rater had him as the number 27 tight end. So again, a situation there where maybe you benefited in DFS or one of these really cool Underdog FFPC weekly tournaments. If you actually didn't play Kelce last week, we'll have more on some fun things you can do for the playoffs in the FFPC, some things you can do in Underdog to create weekly playoff lineups, all of those things on future editions of Stealing Bananas. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, has been Gretch, whom you can follow at Yards Per Gretch. Sign up for Stealing Signals. Sign up for Stealing Lines. We'd love to have you join us over at RotoViz. We've changed the coupon code for people who are maybe looking for a Christmas present or just want to try the product for a couple of weeks, don't want to make that full year plunge. As opposed to 10% off a 1 year, we're giving you 25% off a 1 month if you use the coupon code RVRadio2022 at checkout. Ben and I would love it. If you want to give us a tiny little Christmas present, subscribe to the feed, leave us a rating and review, leave us a comment on YouTube. Those things all help us with the various algorithms. And until Friday, good luck this Thursday night.